My parents kept a shocking secret about my sister. I found the adoption papers hidden in the attic. The papers in the attic would change everything I thought I knew about my family. My name is Lily, and I was 19 years old when my world came crashing down around me. Up until that point, I had what I considered a perfectly normal family life. I lived with my parents and my younger sister Grace in a cozy suburban home in Ohio. We had the white picket fence, the family dog, and the Sunday dinners that always ended with my dad telling terrible jokes that made us all groan. Grace and I were close as sisters could be, despite our 3-year age gap. She was the outgoing one, the popular girl with 100 friends, while I was more of the introverted bookworm who preferred the company of fictional characters to real people. But we balanced each other out, and I wouldn't have traded our relationship for anything. It was a sweltering July afternoon when I first stumbled upon the secret that would tear our family apart. Mom had asked me to find the old photo albums from our childhood that were stored somewhere in the attic. She wanted to show them to our grandmother who was visiting for the weekend. The attic was my least favorite place in the house, dusty, cramped, and filled with shadows that seemed to dance in the dim light filtering through the small window. As I navigated through the maze of boxes and forgotten treasures, my hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath a stack of old newspapers. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried open the floorboard. Inside was a small metal box, locked but rusted enough that I managed to force it open with a screwdriver I found nearby. Inside were documents, official-looking papers with seals and signatures that didn't make sense at first. As I sorted through them, my heart began to pound against my ribs. There were birth certificates, medical records, and legal documents, all with Grace's name on them. But something was wrong. The birth certificate listed different parents than our own. The medical records showed a birth date that matched Grace's, but the hospital was in a different state. And then I found it, the adoption papers, signed 16 years ago, legally transferring Grace from another family to ours. I sat there in the dusty attic, the papers trembling in my hands as my entire understanding of my family shifted. Grace wasn't my biological sister. My parents had adopted her when she was just a baby and never told anyone. Not me, not Grace, not even our extended family. I thought back to all the family stories, all the times my mom had talked about her pregnancy with Grace, the baby shower photos I'd seen, the stories of her birth. All of it was a lie, a carefully constructed fabrication that had been maintained for 16 years. The attic suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me as I struggled to process this revelation. I carefully put the papers back in the box, replaced the floorboard, and made my way downstairs, my mind racing with questions. Why had they kept this secret? Who were Grace's biological parents? And most importantly, how could my parents have deceived us for so long? As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I could hear my mom calling my name, asking if I had found the photo albums yet. I took a deep breath, knowing that our family would never be the same again. I spent the rest of that day in a daze, going through the motions of normal family life while my mind was reeling from what I had discovered. I helped my mom prepare dinner, listened to Grace chatter about her upcoming date with her boyfriend, and even laughed at my dad's terrible jokes during dinner. But underneath it all, I was seething with questions and a growing sense of betrayal. Every time I looked at my parents, I saw strangers who had been living a double life. Every time I looked at Grace, my heart ached for the truth she didn't know. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every memory I had with Grace, trying to find clues I might have missed. Was there something in her appearance that should have tipped me off? A mannerism, a physical trait that didn't match our family? But Grace had always looked like she belonged. She had our mother's eyes and our father's smile. How could I have been so blind? Or more accurately, how could they have been so convincing? The next morning, I waited until Grace had left for her summer job before approaching my parents. They were sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, the picture of domestic normalcy. My hands were shaking as I placed the metal box on the table between them. I didn't say anything at first, just watched as their faces went from confusion to recognition to horror as they realized what I had found. The silence that followed was deafening. My mom's face went pale, and she reached for my dad's hand across the table. He wouldn't meet my eyes, instead focusing on the box as if it contained something dangerous. When they finally spoke, their voices were barely whispers, filled with a mixture of shame and desperation. They confirmed what I already knew. Grace was adopted. They had gone through the process when she was just 3 months old, after years of trying and failing to have a second child. By the time the adoption was finalized, they had already told everyone that my mom was pregnant, and they couldn't figure out how to backtrack without causing confusion and questions. What shocked me more than the adoption itself was their reaction when I asked why they had never told Grace. They looked at each other with such desperation that I almost felt sorry for them. They begged me not to tell her, not to shatter the perfect family they had built. They explained that Grace had always been a sensitive child, prone to anxiety and insecurity. They worried that knowing she was adopted would make her feel unwanted or incomplete, that it would damage her self-esteem at a crucial age. They had planned to tell her when she was older, more mature, but somehow the right time never came, and the longer they waited, the harder it became. As I listened to their explanations, I felt a confusing mix of emotions. Part of me understood their reasoning, their desire to protect Grace from any potential pain or insecurity. But another part of me was furious at their deception, at their decision to play God with Grace's identity. Who were they to decide what Grace could or couldn't handle? How could they deny her the truth about her own life? I left them in the kitchen, still begging me to keep their secret, and retreated to my room. The weight of their request pressed down on me. On one hand, I didn't want to cause Grace pain or disrupt our family. On the other hand, I couldn't imagine living with this knowledge, pretending that everything was normal when it so clearly wasn't. As I sat on my bed, staring out the window at the perfect suburban street that suddenly seemed so artificial, I knew that I couldn't let this go. I needed to understand the full story before I could decide what to do next. The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. I went about my routine, spending time with Grace as if nothing had changed, while secretly digging deeper into the mystery of her adoption. My parents watched me with worried eyes, always ready to remind me of the importance of keeping their secret. But I couldn't let it go. There was something about their story that didn't add up, a nagging feeling that there was more to this than they were letting on. I started my investigation by going through the family photo albums I had originally been sent to find. As I flipped through the pages, I now saw them with new eyes. There were photos of my mom pregnant with me, her growing belly documented month by month. But for Grace, there were only photos of her as a baby, already in our home. No pregnancy photos, no hospital pictures, no newborn shots with my parents in a delivery room. How had I never noticed this before? How had I never questioned the absence of these typical family memories? Next, I turned to the internet, using the information from the adoption papers to search for clues. The papers had listed Grace's birth name as Olivia Thompson, born in a hospital in Pennsylvania to a woman named Jennifer Thompson. The adoption had been handled through a private agency that had since gone out of business. I spent hours in front of my computer screen, following digital breadcrumbs and dead-end leads until I finally found something. A newspaper article from 16 years ago about a tragic accident in Pennsylvania that had killed a young couple, leaving behind their 3-month-old daughter, Olivia. My heart raced as I read the article. Could this be Grace's biological family? The dates matched, the location matched, even the name matched. But why would my parents hide this from Grace? Why would they lie about her origins rather than tell her the truth about what happened to her birth parents? It didn't make sense. If anything, this story seemed more tragic and compelling than the fiction they had created. Why hide the truth when it was so much more powerful than the lie? I needed more information, so I decided to visit the county records office, claiming that I was working on a genealogy project for school. The clerk was helpful, providing me with public records that I couldn't find online. And there it was, the death certificates of Robert and Jennifer Thompson, killed in a car accident on a rainy night in March 16 years ago. And next to their names, the name of their only child, Olivia Thompson, 3 months old at the time of their death. As I sat in the quiet records office, the official documents spread out before me, I felt a chill run down my spine. Grace's biological parents hadn't given her up for adoption. They had died, leaving her an orphan. My parents hadn't adopted her through a standard agency after years of trying to conceive. They had taken in a child who had lost everything, and they had lied about it for 16 years. But the biggest shock came when I found the connection between my family and the Thompsons. Buried in the obituary for Jennifer Thompson was a name that made my blood run cold. My mother's maiden name. Jennifer Thompson had been my mother's college roommate and best friend. They had lost touch after college when my mom moved back to Ohio and Jennifer stayed in Pennsylvania. My mom had attended her funeral, but she had never mentioned this to me, never indicated that she had any connection to Grace before the adoption. Suddenly, everything became clearer. My parents hadn't found Grace through an adoption agency. They had taken her in after their best friends died, and they had decided to raise her as their own, erasing her past and creating a new identity for her. But why? What reason could they possibly have for hiding this truth, not just from Grace, but from me as well? As I gathered my things and left the records office, I knew that I was getting closer to the truth, but I also knew that the answers I found might be more complicated and painful than I could imagine. Armed with this new information, I felt a mix of excitement and dread. I was getting closer to the truth, but each revelation seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Why would my parents go to such lengths to hide Grace's true origins? What were they so afraid of? And most importantly, how would Grace react when she eventually learned the truth? I decided to approach my mother's side of the family, hoping that someone might have information about her friendship with Jennifer Thompson. My grandmother, my mom's mother, had always been a repository of family stories and gossip. I arranged to visit her under the pretense of helping her with some gardening, but my real intention was to probe for information about the past. As we worked in our garden, pruning roses and pulling weeds, I casually mentioned my mom's college days, asking about her friends and roommates. My grandmother's hands paused in their work, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She confirmed that my mom had indeed been close friends with Jennifer Thompson, describing them as inseparable during their college years. They had dreamed of raising their children together, of being aunts to each other's kids. But after college, they had drifted apart, as friends often do when life takes them in different directions. What caught my attention was my grandmother's hesitation when I asked if they had stayed in touch. She mentioned that my mom had attended Jennifer's funeral, but there was something she wasn't telling me, a shadow that crossed her face when she spoke of it. I pressed gently, asking if there had been any contact between our families after the funeral. My grandmother sighed, putting down her gardening tools and motioning for me to sit with her on the bench. What she told me next would change everything. According to my grandmother, my mom had initially planned to adopt Grace officially, to raise her as her own while honoring the memory of her best friend. But there had been complications, legal issues, family objections from Jennifer's side, and most surprisingly, resistance from my father. He had been hesitant to take on the responsibility of raising another child, especially one that came with such a tragic backstory. There had been arguments, tensions that had rippled through our extended family. In the end, they had reached a compromise. They would raise Grace as their own, but they would do it quietly, without the formal adoption process that would have left a paper trail. They would change her name, create a new backstory, and integrate her into our family as if she had always been there. It was a decision that had caused a rift between my mom and some of her family members, including my grandmother, who thought they were making a terrible mistake. As I sat there, listening to my grandmother's story, I felt a mix of emotions: anger at my father for his initial reluctance, confusion about my mother's decision to go along with such a deception, and a growing sense of sympathy for Grace, caught in the middle of a family drama she knew nothing about. But there was still something missing, a piece of the puzzle that would explain why they had maintained this lie for so long, why they had begged me not to tell Grace the truth. My grandmother must have sensed my confusion because she took my hand and looked me straight in the eye. She told me that there was more to the story, something that my parents had never shared with anyone outside their immediate circle, something that might explain their desperation to keep Grace's true identity a secret. But she wouldn't tell me what it was, saying that it wasn't her place to reveal such a significant family secret. She urged me to talk to my parents to demand the full truth before making any decisions about what to do with the information I had gathered. As I drove home that evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the road, I knew that I was at a crossroads. I had uncovered enough information to understand the basic shape of the deception, but there was still a missing piece, a crucial element that would explain everything. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I couldn't rest until I found it. The truth about Grace's adoption was more complex and more painful than I had imagined, and I had a feeling that the final piece of the puzzle would be the most shocking of all. The confrontation with my parents was inevitable. I had gathered enough information to know that they were hiding something significant, something beyond the basic fact of Grace's adoption. I waited until another evening when Grace was out with friends, creating the opportunity for a private family discussion that I knew would be anything but pleasant. I found my parents in the living room, pretending to watch television while their anxious energy filled the room. They had been walking on eggshells around me since I discovered the adoption papers, their eyes always questioning, their voices always hesitant. I didn't waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I placed the documents I had collected on the coffee table between us. The newspaper article about the Thompsons accident, the death certificates, the notes from my conversation with my grandmother. As my parents sifted through the evidence, their faces grew pale. They looked at each other with a mixture of fear and resignation, realizing that the web of lies they had spun for 16 years was finally unraveling. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words and buried secrets. Finally, my mother took a deep breath and began to talk, her voice barely above a whisper as she confirmed what I had already discovered. Jennifer Thompson had indeed been her college roommate and best friend. They had dreamed of their future families, of raising their children together in the same neighborhood, of being there for each other through all of life's milestones. But life had taken them in different directions, and they had lost touch, as friends often do. My mom had only learned of Jennifer's death and the existence of her daughter Grace through a mutual friend who had seen the obituary. What happened next was the part of the story they had hidden so carefully. My mom had immediately reached out to Jennifer's family, offering to take Grace and raise her as her own, honoring her friend's memory by giving her daughter a loving home. But there had been complications, legal battles with Jennifer's in-laws who wanted custody of Grace, questions about my parents' fitness to raise another child, and, most surprisingly, doubts from my own father about taking on such a significant responsibility. The legal battle had been messy and expensive, stretching out for months. In the end, my parents had won custody of Grace, but not without making promises and concessions that would come back to haunt them. The most significant of these was a promise to Jennifer's family that they would never tell Grace the truth about her origins, that they would raise her as their biological daughter without any mention of her tragic past. It was a condition of the custody agreement, a legal requirement that they had willingly accepted in their desperation to bring Grace into their family. But there was more, a darker secret that they had kept even from their own family. As my father spoke, his voice thick with emotion, I learned the truth that had been hidden for 16 years. Jennifer's death hadn't been a simple accident. She and her husband Robert had been killed by a drunk driver, a driver who turned out to be my father's younger brother, my uncle. He had been visiting Ohio at the time, on his way back from a business trip to Pennsylvania when the accident occurred. He had fled the scene, and it wasn't until months later that the truth came out. By then, my parents were already in the process of adopting Grace, already entangled in a web of lies and legal complications. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My uncle, the man I had looked up to my entire life, the one who always brought the best presents at Christmas and told the most exciting stories about his travels, was responsible for the death of Grace's parents. My parents hadn't just hidden Grace's adoption to protect her from feeling unwanted, they had hidden it to protect her from the devastating truth that her biological parents had been killed by a member of her new family. They had hidden it to protect my uncle from legal consequences and public shame. They had hidden it to protect our entire family from a truth so painful and complicated that it threatened to destroy everything we held dear. As I sat there, the weight of their secret pressing down on me, I finally understood the depth of their deception. They hadn't just lied about Grace's adoption. They had created an elaborate fiction to protect multiple people from a truth that was too painful to confront. And in doing so, they had denied Grace the right to know her own history, to understand her own identity, to connect with the family she had lost. The moral implications were staggering, the ethical boundaries blurred beyond recognition. And as I looked at my parents, their faces etched with years of hidden guilt and fear, I knew that I couldn't be complicit in their deception any longer. Grace deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The days following my parents' confession were a blur of emotional turmoil. I was caught between my loyalty to my family and my growing conviction that Grace deserved to know the truth. Every time I looked at her, I saw a different person, not just my sister, but a survivor of tragedy, a living connection to a past she knew nothing about. The weight of this knowledge was crushing, and I knew that I couldn't carry it alone for much longer. I spent hours in my room, scrolling through old photos of the Thompson family that I had found online through obituaries and memorial pages. Jennifer and Robert smiled back at me from their wedding photos, their faces full of hope and dreams for the future. In other photos, they held their newborn daughter Olivia, their love for her evident in every frame. These were real people, not characters in my parents' elaborate fiction. They had lives, families, and a love that had been cut short by a moment of carelessness and a lifetime of consequences. The more I learned about the Thompsons, the more conflicted I became about my role in this deception. On one hand, I understood my parents' desire to protect Grace from such a painful truth. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that they had made this decision more to protect themselves and my uncle than to protect Grace. They had chosen the path of least resistance, the solution that caused the fewest waves in their own lives, without considering the long-term consequences for the person at the center of it all. I reached out to my grandmother again, seeking guidance on how to navigate this moral minefield. She listened patiently as I recounted everything I had learned, her expression growing more somber with each revelation. When I finished, she didn't offer easy answers or simple solutions. Instead, she shared stories from her own life, times when she had faced difficult choices between truth and compassion, between doing what was right and doing what was easy. What she said next stayed with me long after our conversation ended. She told me that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to trust them with the truth, even when it's painful. She reminded me that Grace was no longer a child, but a young woman with the capacity to understand complex emotions and difficult realities. By withholding the truth, my parents weren't just protecting her from pain. They were denying her the opportunity to process her own history, to make her own connections, to form her own understanding of who she was and where she came from. As I walked home from my grandmother's house, the setting sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk, I made my decision. I couldn't continue to be complicit in my parents' deception, no matter how well-intentioned it might have been. Grace deserved to know the truth about her origins, about the family she had lost, and about the circumstances that had brought her into ours. The question was no longer whether I should tell her, but how and when. I spent the next few days planning my approach, knowing that this conversation would change everything. I gathered all the information I had collected, the adoption papers, the newspaper articles, the death certificates, the photos of the Thompson family. I organized them into a folder, creating a timeline of events that Grace could follow as she processed this new information. I even reached out to Jennifer's family through a mutual acquaintance, letting them know that Grace might soon be in touch and asking for their patience and understanding. The hardest part was deciding how to handle the truth about my uncle's involvement in the accident. It was one thing to tell Grace that she was adopted, that her biological parents had died in a car accident. It was another thing entirely to tell her that their death was caused by a member of her new family, a man she had known and loved her entire life as a beloved uncle. I struggled with this aspect of the truth, wondering if some secrets were too painful to be revealed. if some wounds were too deep to be reopened. In the end, I decided that I couldn't pick and choose which parts of the truth to share. The full story was complicated and messy, filled with pain and guilt and love in equal measure. But it was Grace's story, and she had the right to know all of it, to make her own decisions about how to move forward. I would be there to support her, to help her navigate the emotional aftermath, but I couldn't make those decisions for her. As I sat in my room, the folder of documents on my desk, I knew that the conversation I was about to have would be the most difficult of my life. But I also knew that it was necessary, that it was the right thing to do, for Grace, for my family, and for my own conscience. The truth had been hidden for too long, and it was time to bring it into the light, no matter how painful that process might be. The moment of truth arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Grace had returned from a day out with friends, her laughter echoing through the house as she recounted stories from her adventures. I watched her from the doorway of the living room, my heart heavy with the knowledge that her world was about to be turned upside down. I asked if we could talk in private, suggesting a walk to the park where we had spent so much time as children. As we walked side by side, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, I struggled to find the right words to begin this life-altering conversation. Grace sensed my seriousness, her usual chatter giving way to concerned silence. When we reached the park, we sat on our favorite bench, the one overlooking the small pond where we had fed ducks countless times as children. I started by asking Grace if she had ever felt different from our family, if there had ever been moments when she felt like she didn't quite belong. She looked at me with confusion, assuring me that she had always felt loved and accepted, that she had never questioned her place in our family. Her response made what I had to do even harder, but it also reinforced my conviction that she deserved to know the truth, even if it would complicate her sense of belonging. I began by telling her about the adoption papers I had found in the attic, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to hurt. I explained that our parents had adopted her when she was just 3 months old, after the death of her biological parents. I shared the details I had learned about Jennifer and Robert Thompson, showing her photos of the couple who had brought her into the world, who had loved her with all their hearts for the short time they had together. Grace's reaction was a mixture of emotions: shock at the revelation, sadness for the parents she had never known, and anger at our parents for hiding this truth for so long. She asked dozens of questions, her mind racing to make sense of this new information, to reconcile the identity she had always known with the one she was just discovering. I answered as honestly as I could, sharing everything I had learned, while acknowledging that there were still gaps in the story that only our parents could fill. The hardest part came when I had to tell her about the circumstances of her parents' death. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the impact of this final revelation. I explained that they had been killed by a drunk driver, a detail that brought fresh tears to Grace's eyes. And then I delivered the most painful truth of all, that the driver responsible for their death was our uncle, my father's brother. The impact of this final revelation was immediate and devastating. Grace stood up from the bench, pacing back and forth as she struggled to process this additional layer of tragedy. Her anger at our parents intensified, her sense of betrayal deepening as she realized the full extent of their deception. They hadn't just hidden her adoption to protect her from feeling unwanted. They had hidden it to protect the man who had taken her parents away from her. In the days that followed, our family dynamics shifted dramatically. Grace confronted our parents, her voice filled with a pain that had been building for 16 years. The conversation was emotional and raw, with tears and accusations flying back and forth. Our parents tried to explain their reasoning, their voices thick with guilt and regret. They admitted that they had made mistakes, that they had allowed their fear and self-preservation to cloud their judgment. They apologized for the pain they had caused, for the years of deception that had denied Grace the truth about her own life. The aftermath was messy and complicated. Grace needed space to process everything, to grieve for the parents she had never known, and to reconcile her feelings for the family that had raised her. She reached out to Jennifer's family, establishing connections that would help her understand her biological heritage. She also had difficult conversations with our uncle, who had been living with his own guilt for 16 years, hidden behind a wall of family secrets. As for me, I found myself in the role of mediator, helping to bridge the gap between Grace and our parents, supporting my sister as she navigated this new reality. Our relationship deepened through this crisis, forged in the fires of truth and honesty. We learned to communicate more openly, to trust each other with our vulnerabilities and fears. Months later, as I sat with Grace on the same park bench where we had had that life-altering conversation, I reflected on the journey we had been through. Our family would never be the same, but in many ways, we were stronger than before. The secrets that had once threatened to tear us apart had ultimately brought us closer together, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths and to rebuild our relationships on a foundation of honesty. Grace had decided to keep her name, to continue being part of our family, while also honoring the memory of her biological parents. She had found a way to hold both identities in her heart, to love both families without diminishing her connection to either. It was a delicate balance, a complex emotional dance that she navigated with grace and maturity beyond her years. As we watched the sunset over the pond, casting long shadows across the water, I realized that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to trust them with the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Grace had deserved to know her story, to understand her past, and to make her own choices about how to move forward. By keeping this secret, our parents had denied her that fundamental right, that basic human need to know where we come from and how we became who we are. The truth had indeed set us free, but not without a price. There were scars that would take years to heal, trust that would need to be rebuilt piece by piece. But as Grace leaned her head on my shoulder, her presence a comforting weight beside me, I knew that we would get through this together, as a family redefined by truth and strengthened by honesty.